All right, Tim. So Nuggets have lost 3 games in a row. The Minnesota game, which you called, you were on hand for. You saw that one courtside. The Bulls loss, one of the most embarrassing losses of the season. And then this loss just yesterday against the Knicks, national TV. What's been your takeaway from these last 3 losses? Obviously, you saw one of them up close and personal, but what's been kind of the biggest trend you've seen with this Nuggets team recently?
Well, all right. So let's go back to the Minnesota game. And I called the game. And going into that, they'd won 12 out of 15,
Yeah.
just playing really well. In fact, so well that when you looked at the landscape of the West, you got Oklahoma City, clearly everybody will agree that it has been on a different level than everybody else in the West this year. So the question becomes, who's going to close the gap with them and claim that real estate as maybe the second best team, and a team that you could see envisioning playing them in the conference finals, because we expect Oklahoma City to get there. And it looked like Denver was rounding into that team. Now, that's not to take anything away from Houston, because they continue to impress. They're not going anywhere. But I still think with such a lack of deep playoff experience amongst those guys, and not really having that true identifiable top of the food chain offensive player on your team, I think it's reasonable to think there are some questions about them. Memphis is right there as well. But again, I think Memphis can be inconsistent. And when you got Denver playing as well as they were playing and the best player in the NBA on your team, it started to look like, you know what? If they can avoid Oklahoma City's bracket, which basically means get to 2 or 3,
Yeah.
they've got a great chance to end up being that second team that's standing, the last man standing against Oklahoma City. And that's kind of what Michael Malone made me feel like when I talked to him before the game in Minnesota. He was in such a good mood. He was so impressed with the way his team has played. He was citing all these numbers over that 15-game stretch and the way they had climbed in rating on both ends of the floor and all these things. And everything was great. Raving about Russell Westbrook, raving about Jokic, obviously. And then the game happened. and I'm sitting there calling the game, and I'm like, they offered no resistance.
None.
And I kept thinking to myself, and my partner on the call, Mark Jones, we go to break and we were like, okay, like they got to make a run. I thought halftime, when they gave up basically 70 points in the first half, I thought halftime Michael Malone's going to get into them. They're going to come out. They're going to show some resistance and push back like right here. It never happened. And they got blown out, man. And I'm like, okay. So then I leave there that night. I'm like, okay, I definitely didn't see their best version. I was very impressed with Minnesota, but I didn't see Denver's best version. So it is what it is. It's a long season. Chalk it up to a one-off. And then Chicago happens. And now you're like,
man.
okay, what is that? Like, that's a game. If you get embarrassed by Minnesota, then you got to go make the statement against Chicago, right? That's just something that has to happen. They don't do that. The Knicks loss, I'm not too worried about. It's a really good team on the road. That's a tough place to play. I'm not too worried about that. Now, the trend over these 3 games is the defense has been anemic, and now they're starting to change their lineup that they were having great success with, because Aaron Gordon is back now, and it's been enough of the off-the-bench thing. Now he's back in the starting lineup, and Christian Brown goes to the bench. So, like, that's different. So right now, yeah, it's a little bit more unstable than it was a week ago. But overall, what I've seen out of them over the last month, I'm pretty encouraged about the Nuggets.
Yeah. Well, that makes me feel a little better. But like you said, the defense, they gave up 133 to the Timberwolves, 129 to the Bulls. And that Bulls game, that's the one that did it for me. The defense against Chicago in that game was just so non-existent, no resistance or anything. One guy who has been playing well, though, is Jamal Murray. He's coming out of his winter hibernation here. He had 25 against Minnesota in that game. These last 10 games, averaging almost 24 points per game. Are you seeing the old Jamal Murray more and more? Like, do you think this renaissance from him is legit? Like, is he looking like the Jamal Murray of old to you?
He really is. And even the night the Minnesota game started there. Like, my first time seeing him, and look this good in a while. And I said it before the game. I said it to Mark Jones. I said, man, Jamal looks like he's going to cook tonight. Like, I was just watching him warm up, and it was just so effortless. He was moving so good. The ball wasn't hitting the rim, and all of the stuff he was doing pregame, and that carried over. Now, they weren't very good as a team, but Jamal Murray was really good in that game offensively, and he got what he wanted. And remember, like, this was a team that bottled him up. And I know he was dealing with a calf injury last year in the playoffs, but they embarrassed him early in that series with their defensive pressure and their length, and they targeted him to take him out. And they did it even in the comeback game in Game 7. Like, so that was still lingering in the air against this team. And so Jamal Murray came out and he was operating with absolutely no restrictions, and he did what he wanted to do offensively. Of everything that's happened the last 3 games, like, that to me would be the one I'm more focused on than short-term real defensive issues for them, or a lack of competitive spirit against Minnesota and Chicago. I'm sure Michael Malone would agree with that. I'd be, yeah, okay. You don't want to see that when you've been playing that well, but honestly, I'd concentrate more on the flip side with Jamal Murray. That to me is one of the single biggest determining factors for what this team's ceiling is going to be in the postseason. And Jamal Murray right now looks really good physically, in rhythm, and it just looks like he's back again operating at 100%.
Yeah. I mean, to me and a lot of people, it is the single most determining factor when you're looking at this team and how high is their playoff ceiling. Can they still be in this top tier championship contenders? It comes down to Jamal. It really does. I mean, Nikola Jokic is going to be that guy in the playoffs. I think you have some confidence, especially in some of these other, top role guys, the Aaron Gordons of the world, Christian Brown, some other questions on the roster. But I mean, if they're going to ascend to that tier, I don't know if they can get to Oklahoma City's tier this season, but if they can get to a championship contending level, it's going to be because Jamal Murray's Jamal Murray again.
Totally agree with that. And because here, look, the bottom line is, from an initiation standpoint with a live dribble, outside of Jokic, he represents like the only other real threat. I mean, Westbrook has played very well in this role, but he's got serious limitations with his shooting. Now, he makes up for it in other ways, and he's giving Denver something they desperately needed. The athleticism, the speed, the competitiveness, I think, has been something that's been eye-opening to all of them. The verbal competitiveness on a daily basis. And Michael Malone has described it as a bunch of nice guys that are quiet. That's what they were before. Westbrook is not that. He's not quiet, and they've needed some of that. So he's brought a lot, but he is not a guy that, is with a live dribble initiate your offense. He's very consistent at this stage of his career. Jamal Murray is a totally different weapon. And when he's operating at his best, the 2-man game, what that involves with Jokic and what that requires to stop that, when Jokic is off the floor, being able to run it through Murray, able to let him hunt shots off ball screen or dribble handoffs. When he's playing like this, like, you buy into like ultimately what they could be. You got to remember, like, though, last year in 12 playoff games, he shot 40% from the field, and he wasn't right. He was not right. If he looks like this when they get to the playoffs, depending on where they're seated, they've got a much better chance to get through a couple of rounds if they avoid Oklahoma City than they would have last year when he was playing the way he was and feeling the way he was physically.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to another big storyline that happened last night in this loss to the Knicks. The Nuggets change up their starting lineup. Aaron Gordon has been coming off this bench for this great stretch of basketball that Nuggets had played before, these last 2 losses prior to tonight, when they've looked as connected, they've looked in as good of a rhythm as they've been in all season. It's because of it. A lot of it was because of him playing with the second unit, but it did seem like eventually they were going to bring him back into the starting lineup. He was back there last night. The result was Christian Brown goes to the bench. Russell Westbrook sticks in the starting lineup. And I think there's a couple reasons why they did it. I mean, one of the storylines of Russell Westbrook's season is he has been amazing. A big reason is that he's playing with Nikola Jokic. Those two sharing the floor together has been a key to Russell Westbrook's success. That 2-man game, Michael Malone called that 2-man game like the most potent in basketball, which is very interesting. I feel like there's a lot of levels to that, especially with him being teammates with Jamal Murray. But what was your reaction to that? And what do you think of that starting lineup? Jamal Murray, Russell Westbrook, Michael Porter, Aaron Gordon, and Nikola Jokic.
Yeah, when we talked to Michael Malone before the Minnesota game, and Aaron Gordon at that time still coming off the bench, minutes restriction after the injury, and he said, listen, Aaron came to them and said, listen, man, when I am ready to go and I'm fully back, if you still want to bring me off the bench, I'm totally fine with it. Whatever it takes to help the team win. So he was kind of praising him for his unselfishness, leadership.
Yep.
So that seemed to be taken off the table. Like that mindset, which is a real thing with some players. Like, they're in a better place mentally starting. That didn't seem to be a factor for Michael Malone. And he said there's no timeline on this. I don't know. And he also said, by the way, he didn't know necessarily, depending on the matchup, what he was going to go with going forward. Maybe
Right.
it's not always the same, depending on what you need size-wise, right? Because one of the things I noticed in the Minnesota game was when you didn't have him on the court, you basically had three guards, a thin, long wing in Michael Porter Jr., not the most physical guy in the world, and Jokic. What I noticed was they were attacking by coming out of the blitzes on Anthony Edwards. The ball was going into the middle of the floor, usually to Gobert, and then Jokic would rotate up on that. Now, the guys that were trying to protect the rim on these baseline slashes and lobs were guards, and they looked
Mm-hmm.
really small against that team. And so I think it kind of stood out to me, and I was like, okay, you know what? There's going to be nights that you're just going to have more minutes out of a bigger lineup. And I think that's probably where Michael Malone is going to fall, but I don't know that he's going to go with this all the time. Aaron Gordon, look, they won a championship with him as a starter. So, you're hoping a peak level, we get back to that. I don't think this will affect Christian Brown's psyche. He's still going to play 30 minutes, probably a lot of nights, starters minutes. He's a young player. I think he can handle this and cope with it. Westbrook, you're not going to bring him off the bench, I don't think, because of what you said. If you bring him off the bench, you lose 12 minutes to 14 minutes at the start of the game and the start of the second half that he's not playing with Jokic. Because that's just the way it works. You're not subbing a guy in 3 minutes into the half. Usually those guys sub in 6-7 minutes in minimum. And so that's 12 to 14 minutes you've taken off the plate. He will not play with Jokic on that night. And by the way, if he does check in at that point, a couple minutes later, Jokic is checking out. So just you start to look at the way these pieces are stacked. You're going to have too many minutes without a very valuable combination that has proven to be getting better and better and better. And the whole league is noticing how good he's
Mm-hmm.
been with Jokic. You got to max out the time on the court with him. So that's why you add all that up. Christian Brown was going to be the guy to go to the bench, and now give it more of a sample size to see how this looks and how this plays out over time. I'm not too concerned about it either way, because Michael Malone has flexibility with what kind of lineup he wants to play to close games, during the games. But at the start, I think you're better off having Westbrook on the floor as a starter and Christian Brown being the guy that accepts the fact that Aaron Gordon's been a starter on this team, won a title with this team. You need more size in that starting lineup. It makes sense to me.
Yeah. And I think they'll go with this for a little bit, see how it goes, get some data on it, and then reassess. But I think there's a chance this could be the lineup for the rest of the season. Lastly, trade deadline's coming up, just over a week away from it. This team's been up and down this season. Just from your perspective, do you think they need a move? Maybe it's minor, maybe it's major. I'm guessing you don't think they need a major move, but how would you kind of approach the trade deadline if you were in the Nuggets brain trust, and where would you look to maybe get some help?
I don't know that I'm like of the mindset that, oh man, Denver's got to do something. I really
Okay.
think what I said in the beginning is true. I think I probably right now, and this is before I see what Dallas looks like with an extended period of time with Luka back, because they're just trying to keep their head above water right now without him. When he comes back, and I think going into the year, I thought they got better, but we haven't seen them whole enough to know that. So let's see when he comes back. And then maybe I go, you know what, after a month of that, actually Dallas is still the team that's going to end up against Oklahoma City. But right now, short of that, without seeing that, I still think it's Denver is the most logical team to me. Now, you might say, well, yeah, but what about closing the gap with OKC? Look, bottom line is this: Oklahoma City doesn't have a ton of playoff success together. So that they're still missing that. This isn't like some team that's been in the finals the last 2 years and added, a guy like Hartenstein, added Caruso. They're still trying to figure out how to even get to the conference finals. So as a result, I don't know that I would panic if I were Denver. if something popped up and made it obvious built around your role players, I guess you'd have to look at that. Certainly, if it was something that can make you better defensively without sacrificing offensive rhythm, you take a look at that. But I don't know, man. I kind of want to see this group and what Michael Malone's going to do now with a little bit of a different lineup. Let me see an extended period of this and what it looks like. Unfortunately, obviously, an extended period means you're past the trading deadline. You're past the point of no return if it doesn't work out, and you could have done something. I don't know that there's going to be obvious moves available to them that are going to make them better and more valuable. I think they have a really good shot of ending up being the second best team in the Western Conference.
Yeah. And if you get that, I mean, I think you got to feel pretty comfortable being on the opposite side of the bracket from OKC and with, your championship experience. So that makes sense to me.
No doubt about it. And look, going in, and let's just say it played out that way. They get the 2 or the 3 seed. Let's say they get the 3 seed and they avoid OKC and they end up getting into the conference finals. A team like OKC that lost in the second round a year ago, yeah, they got better. But look, by the way, OKC still has stuff to figure out. They've got to get Chet Holmgren back and figure out their lineups that they want to play. Like, how much can you play Hartenstein and Chet together? Does that work? We don't even know. We haven't even seen it. And if it doesn't work, how does that affect the minutes for Hartenstein and his overall effectiveness? So that they got stuff to figure out down the road, but you'd be going into a series with Nikola Jokic. And by the way, if you end up as the 3 seed and you win 2 rounds, that means you're red hot. You're feeling good. You just navigated a couple of tough series. I think most people in Denver would take their chances against OKC in a 7-game series with Nikola Jokic leading the way. When you've gotten yourself to that point, it means you're in a really good place. And OKC still hasn't broken through the second round.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Tim, I appreciate it, man. Thank you.
Anytime.